Hey family, welcome back to Kingdom South Plus, where we work the words of Jesus beyond Sunday. If this is your first time here, my name is Pastor Sean. I'm grateful that you're listening to this wherever you get your podcast. Yesterday was week 5 of our summer series, KS at the Movies, our attempt to copy the illustrative genius of Jesus by using movies as modern day parables. On the docket for this week was Creed 3. The text that we chose to undergird this modern day parable is Genesis 27, verse 41 from the New Living Translation. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme, I will soon be mourning my father's death. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. I want to jump right into this week's recap because the parallels between this movie and this text are striking. Genesis 27 offers one of the Bible's most complicated family stories. Isaac, now elderly and nearly blind, prepares to bestow his patriarchal blessing upon his firstborn son. Now, to fully appreciate this moment, we must distinguish between two important concepts: the birthright and the blessing. Earlier in Genesis 25, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. The birthright referred primarily to the legal privileges of the firstborn, including a double portion of the inheritance and the status that came with being the eldest son. The blessing, however, was the father's spoken declaration over his son. It affirmed identity, conferred authority, and invoked God's favor upon the recipient. Though distinct, the two were closely connected, making the loss of both especially devastating for Esau. Complicating matters further, Jacob, who was encouraged by his mother Rebekah, deceives his blind father into giving him Esau's blessing. When Esau discovers what has happened, he is overcome with grief and outrage because the blessing cannot simply be revoked or reassigned, leaving Esau convinced that his future has been stolen. It is in that moment, at the intersection of brotherhood, bitterness, and betrayal, that we march right into the theater for this week's movie. Creed 3 picks up years after Adonis Creed has retired from boxing. After having built the life many dream about, a successful career, a loving family, and a respected legacy inside and outside the ring. Everything changes, however, when Dame Anderson, Adonis's childhood friend, is released from prison after serving an 18-year sentence. As teenagers, Dame was considered the more gifted boxer, while Adonis was the troubled kid he looked after. But one night, a violent encounter changed both of their lives. Dame went to prison while Adonis walked away and eventually became the heavyweight champion of the world. Though both men made choices that contributed to where they ended up, the years created two very different stories. One man spent nearly 2 decades building a future. The other spent nearly 2 decades believing that future had been taken from him. So when Dame comes back, he's not simply looking for another chance. He believes he's coming back to reclaim the life that should have been his. What begins as a reunion between old friends before long turns sour as admiration gives way to accusation, brotherhood gives way to bitterness, and the boxing ring becomes the place where they finally settle the score. What do we do when someone else is living the life we thought was supposed to be ours? That's the question waiting for us here in Genesis 27. Esau believes Jacob has received what rightfully belonged to him. Now, although the circumstances are different, the struggle is strikingly similar. In both stories, a perceived loss becomes fertile ground for resentment, and resentment, if left unchecked, begins to see revenge as justice. So I want to offer 3 movements that I shared in yesterday's message that I believe we can extract some principles from and hopefully put them into practice. Number 1, recognize the hurt. Genesis 27 doesn't hide Esau's hurt. The text tells us exactly why he responded the way he did, because of the blessing his father had given Jacob. The same is true in Creed 3. Dame's response was destructive, but his pain was real. He lost 18 years watching someone else live the life he believed should have been his and never truly processed the pain of disappointment. Unfortunately, one of the greatest obstacles to healing, which has been popularized in church culture, is denial. Somewhere along the way, many of us learn that faith means pretending we're fine, smiling through the pain, and calling avoidance strength. Yet Scripture never asks us to deny our emotions. I want to read that line. Scripture never asks us to deny our emotions. As a matter of fact, the only thing Scripture does is invites us to bring them before God, because emotions don't disappear just because we ignore them. They go underground and set up a secret headquarters inside out, where they continue to influence our lives. Here's the big point. You can't heal if you won't deal. You can't heal if you won't deal. Number 2, release the grudge. If recognizing the hurt is the first step toward healing, releasing the grudge is the second. This is where our translations provide a beautiful layer of insight. The NET and the NLT tell us Esau hated Jacob, emphasizing the depth of his emotional pain. The NASB and the NIV, however, tell us Esau held a grudge against Jacob, emphasizing what he chose to do with the pain. Now, these aren't two competing ideas, they're complementary. Hatred describes what Esau felt. A grudge describes what Esau fed. And that's an important distinction, because we cannot always control what we feel. But by God's grace, we can choose what we feed. We learned last week that feelings often arrive uninvited, yet grudges are sustained over time. Every replayed conversation, every rehearsed offense, every imagined confrontation becomes another brick in the prison resentment builds around the heart. That's exactly what we see here in the movie Creed 3. Dame's hurt doesn't remain a wound. Over 18 years, it hardens into resentment until revenge starts to feel right. This is why Jesus tells Peter to forgive 77 times. There's this encounter in Matthew 18 where Jesus is responding to Peter, like, how often should we forgive? And I offered a different kind of take in yesterday's message that I want to share in this recap. That Jesus is not simply saying we should forgive people as often as they sin against us or as often as they offend us. I want to argue that it is a bit more layered than that. Because people will offend you, people will sin against you. And sometimes the only implications of that were the action. But then there are times where they offend us or they sin against us, and it has lasting implications or consequences. For example, if someone steals your identity and they mess up your credit, you can forgive them for stealing your identity, essentially releasing them from the penalty, recognizing that they owe you a debt they cannot pay. So you accept what Jesus did on the cross as satisfactory payment for the sin or the offense committed against you. Yet at the same time, because they messed up your credit in stealing your identity, there's some practical implications that you're going to have to go through. Now, when you go to get a house, now when you go to get a car, now when you go to take out a loan, you don't have the necessary credit requirements because someone messed up your credit, because someone stole your identity. So every time you try to do something that requires credit, it's going to remind you of the offense. And Jesus is saying you're going to have to forgive them again. I think in church, we have made it seem as though forgiveness is this one-time event. And for some, hey, I don't want to tussle. If that's what you believe, fine. I don't necessarily believe it's incorrect, but I do believe it's incomplete. Because there are times where we are impacted beyond that initial offense. And Jesus is saying every time the implications of that person's actions come up before you, you're going to have to forgive them again. Every time you're reminded of what they did and what it means for the life you've had to live as a result, you're going to have to forgive them again. I think that's worth all the effort and energy it took you to listen to this pod today. Again, it's not a one time, because what the enemy does is he will convince you that because you're still upset, that you haven't forgiven them. And I'm telling you that forgiveness is more layered than that. So this is why releasing the grudge becomes so important, because every time you are confronted with the implications of that person's actions, you got a decision to make. You're going to give that to God, or you're going to hold a grudge. God or grudge. Those are the options. Because here's the truth. The longer we hold a grudge, the more the grudge begins to hold us. All right, number 3. Rewrite the story. Rewrite the story. The final movement of healing begins when we take accountability for who we become. Now, if you are familiar with our philosophy at Kingdom South, we are passionate about formation. We believe that the goal of the Christian life is for us to become like Jesus. So who we become matters. It speaks to the sum of our lives. Who we become matters. So one of the most difficult parts of rewriting our story is acknowledging that while we cannot control someone else's choices, we are always responsible for our own. Accountability doesn't erase another person's sins, nor does it minimize the hurt we've experienced. It simply widens the conversation to include the part we play. Now, I want to make a disclaimer. I want to give a disclaimer, same disclaimer I offered in our live gathering. There are times where we are the victims of injustice, and we have done nothing to contribute to deserve the treatment. I am not oblivious to that reality. So there are times where we are the victims of injustice, and there was nothing we could have done to alter the outcome. Someone else chose to manage their free will in a way that was irresponsible and destructive. And we were the recipients of that. I am not talking about those situations. Let me say it again. There are times where you and I are the recipients of injustice, and we had nothing to do with it. Someone else chose to manage their free will in a way that was destructive and harmful to us. I am not talking about those instances. I am talking about the instances where things are done to us and we had a part to play. This is what makes Genesis 27 and Creed 3 so compelling. Esau grieves the blessing he lost, but he rarely reflects on the birthright he willingly surrendered. So after he discovers what has happened, and he's talking about Jacob being essentially living up to his name, trickster, he's like, he cheated me twice. And it's like, well, Esau, are you forgetting what went down in Genesis 25? Esau comes in, he's hungry. Jacob offers him a bowl of stew in exchange for his birthright. Now, is Jacob being manipulative? Absolutely. Is Jacob plotting? Absolutely. Is Jacob trying to use Esau's weakness? Absolutely. So we're not excusing that. Yet at the same time, the Bible tells us that Esau showed contempt for his birthright. So he's like, yo, I'm dying of starvation. So what good is this birthright to me? So he had no real value for what was valuable. So he gave it away. But of course, he doesn't see that. Now, when it comes to this blessing, yeah, they absolutely got you with that. But that birthright, you gave that away. You surrendered that. So instead of focusing on the role he plays in the way his life is turning out, he chooses to only focus on someone else's actions. Likewise, Dame spends years blaming Adonis for the life he didn't have, yet the film reminds us of another reality. Bianca reminds Adonis that Dame had the gun. As they're sitting down and they're talking about the story, she's like, he had the gun. So in that instance, he's going to be in trouble because he had the gun. His imprisonment wasn't merely the result of someone else's actions. It was also shaped by his own choices. Now, again, neither story excuses betrayal or disappointment, but they remind us that healing begins when we dare to own our part. And this is one of the hardest truths in the Christian life because accountability requires humility. It is far easier to catalog another person's failures than to confront our own. Yet Jesus consistently calls us as his followers to look inward before we look outward. Remove the plank from our own eye before addressing the speck in someone else's. Rewriting the story doesn't mean pretending the past never happened. It means refusing to let the past become an excuse for the person we become. By God's grace, we cannot change what happened to us, but we can choose what happens in us. And that is where healing begins. That is where a new story is written. I hope this recap added some value to your life. It was a really good Sunday. This entire series has just been really good. A little heavier emotionally than I anticipated it being, but I believe it's needed and necessary for this time and for this season. If you have missed any of the recaps during this Chaos at the Movie series, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to all of them right here on Kingdom South Plus, which is available in everywhere you get podcasts at this point. We've also added it to Substack, which has become a distribution platform for podcasts. So if you're on Substack, you can listen to it there as well. I've got one ask of you. It is the only ask I'll ever ask of you, and that is, if this added value to your life, would you help me help more people? Would you send this to someone you know who needs to hear this recap? This week, we're gearing up for week 6 of our series as we prepare to explore the movie Annie. I believe she has some things that she can teach us about faith. Until next time, this is Kingdom South Plus, where we work the words of Jesus beyond Sunday.